The moment still burns in my chest like a public slap. The ballroom of the Riverside Community Center smelled like cheap perfume and burnt coffee. Folding chairs scraped the floor as people turned to stare at me. I stood near the exit, clutching my purse with shaking fingers, my cheeks hot with shame. I hadn't planned to cry in front of strangers, but humiliation doesn't ask for permission. My husband, Mark, stood 3 feet away from me, arms crossed, lips curled in a smile that wasn't kind. He looked proud, like this was a performance he had rehearsed. He laughed softly and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't act surprised. You were never anything without my money." The words landed hard, heavy, ugly. For a second, no one spoke. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow down. The room fell into an awkward silence where every breath sounded too loud. I could feel eyes on my back, waiting to see if I would beg or break. Then, something unexpected happened. A man in a dark blue suit stood up from the second row. I had noticed him earlier, quiet, calm, watching everything. He walked straight toward us, pulled out his phone, and said in a clear voice, "Mark, you might want to rethink this. Right now." Murmurs spread across the room like electricity. Heads turned, whispers started. Mark's smile faded. "Who are you?" he snapped. The man didn't raise his voice. He simply showed Mark the screen. Whatever Mark saw drained the color from his face. His shoulders stiffened. His confident laugh died in his throat. People who had been judging me seconds ago were now staring at him. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." Mark took a step back. For the first time, he looked small, embarrassed, exposed. I stayed silent, but inside, something shifted. Because what Mark didn't know was that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. He had no idea who I really was, or why that man stood up for me without hesitation. He didn't know what I had already rebuilt in silence. And he definitely didn't know how this story would end. But to understand how my husband could take my money, throw me out, and still think he had won, we need to go back. Back to 3 years earlier, on a rainy October night, when I trusted him with everything I had and signed the paper that changed my life forever. Before we continue, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to Social Old Channel. We're creating a community of people who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now, back to the story. Rain pattered softly against the tall windows of the small apartment we shared on that October night 3 years ago. The city smelled like wet asphalt and distant street food, a mixture that somehow felt comforting. I remember standing by the window, a cup of tea warming my hands, while Mark paced behind me, talking about his day. He laughed, the sound warm and magnetic, and for a moment I felt the world shrink to just the two of us. "I can't believe you remembered," he said, smiling as he placed a small box on the table. Inside, a delicate necklace glimmered under the dim light. It was nothing extravagant, but it was thoughtful, and that mattered more than the value. I smiled, touched, because it wasn't the jewelry that mattered. It was the intention, the care, the feeling that someone saw me completely. That's the thing about Mark. He had a way of making you feel special, making you believe that the entire world revolved around your happiness, until it didn't. Over the next few months, we built our life together in small, almost invisible ways. Shared coffee in the morning, quiet walks in the park, laughing at silly TV shows late at night. I trusted him with my heart, my dreams, even my finances. I believed in the life we were creating, convinced that love could cover even the sharp edges of reality. But love has a way of blinding you. The day I signed the papers that would later become my cage, I didn't feel the weight. Mark presented them with a casual smile, words coded in reassurance. "It's just to make things easier in the future," he said, "for both of us. Don't worry about it." I hesitated for a moment, looking at the formal, legal words printed neatly across the page. Something in my gut whispered caution, but he reached across the table, took my hand in his, and whispered, "Trust me, always." And I did. I signed. It was raining hard that night when we left the lawyer's office. The streets glistened like black glass under the neon lights, and I held Mark's hand tightly, oblivious to the storm both outside and inside. He laughed, kissed my forehead, and promised me a life full of comfort, security, and love. I wanted to believe him with every fiber of my being. For months, everything seemed perfect. I was his partner, his confidant. Friends would comment on how in sync we were, how we seemed to complete each other. I felt proud, lucky, like I had won something rare in this chaotic world. But small cracks started to appear, soft whispers in the quiet moments. The first time I realized something was off was over dinner at a friend's house. Mark had a way of turning conversations, twisting words to make me seem foolish or ungrateful. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was joking, maybe I was too sensitive. Then came the money, the small withdrawals, the subtle shifts in how he spoke about our finances, about my contribution versus our shared responsibilities. I noticed, but every time I tried to question it, he would laugh, charming and infuriating at all once, and somehow I found myself apologizing instead of him. It wasn't sudden, it was slow, insidious, and love, or what I thought was love, kept me blind. By the time the real betrayal hit, I was already entangled, already invested, already trusting a man who had learned exactly how to take without giving. That October night when I signed those papers was the beginning of a 3-year descent that I hadn't seen coming. I had unknowingly handed over not just money, but control, power, and eventually, dignity. And yet, even in those dark months, there were glimmers of who I really was. Moments when I smiled, laughed, and held my ground without realizing the strength quietly building inside me. I couldn't see it then, but I was already preparing myself for the confrontation, for the fight, for the moment when the man who had laughed at my trust would realize he had underestimated me entirely. Because love might have blinded me once, but pain, betrayal, and survival would sharpen my eyes. And that's how it all began. The first time I truly saw Mark for who he was, it wasn't in a moment of shouting or rage. It was in the quiet, almost invisible moments. The subtle dismissals, the casual insults, the way he counted every cent and every favor I offered as if my existence were a transaction. It started small, a sharp remark about my cooking one evening. "You know, I think your mother did it better." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. Maybe he was just joking, I told myself. But the words lodged somewhere deep inside, tiny seeds of doubt and fear. Then came the money. The first time I noticed something missing was when I checked our joint account to pay a bill. A large sum had been withdrawn. No explanation, no note. I confronted him. "Mark, what's this? Why is the money gone?" He shrugged casually, leaning back in his chair like I was overreacting. "It's just a transfer, darling. Don't worry about it. I know what I'm doing." I wanted to trust him because I had to. Trust had been the foundation of our life together. But a cold knot formed in my stomach, a whisper I tried to ignore. Something is wrong. Over the next months, the small slights became sharper, more intentional. Conversations turned into power plays. He would belittle my decisions, question my judgment in front of friends, and even in private, he found ways to make me feel small. Each time I tried to stand up for myself, he would twist it. "You're overreacting. I'm just trying to help you. You really need to stop being so dramatic." I began questioning myself. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I had imagined it. But deep down, I felt the sting, the humiliation, the slow erosion of my self-worth. Then came the contracts, the financial agreements I had trusted blindly. Mark had convinced me they were for our mutual benefit, but in reality, they were a cage, one that he controlled completely.
Every withdrawal, every investment, every penny I had worked for or saved was now at his mercy. And the scariest part, I had willingly handed it over. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle, the control, the constant reminder that no matter how hard I tried, I was never enough on my own. I was just a reflection of his generosity, or lack thereof. I tried to fight back quietly at first. A little secret here, a small savings there. I kept meticulous records, notes, evidence of everything just in case. The seed of resistance grew slowly inside me, nurtured by humiliation and anger alike. But Mark, he didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and that was part of his arrogance. He believed I was dependent, fragile, and incapable of real defiance. He underestimated the quiet strength that comes from desperation. By the end of that year, the person I had been, the trusting, loving woman who believed in happy endings, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned to survive under the weight of betrayal, to hide strength behind a smile, and to wait for the right moment to reclaim what had been stolen. It was during one particularly cruel incident that I realized just how far he would go. At a family dinner, he casually revealed to everyone that I had financially failed at managing even small household matters. Friends murmured, my cheeks burned, and I wanted to disappear. He laughed like it was a joke, but the shame was real, and the power imbalance undeniable. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. For the first time, I didn't cry out of love, longing, or hope. I cried out of anger. Anger at being blinded, at being manipulated, at having been taught to doubt myself while he strutted around as if victorious. Something inside me shifted that night. I knew that I could not remain a victim, not if I wanted to survive, not if I wanted to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my independence. And so, in silence, I began planning. Every conversation, every transaction, every subtle lie he told me became part of the roadmap. I was collecting pieces of his arrogance, his secrets, and his overconfidence, storing them away until the day they would be my weapon. Mark believed he had me cornered, trapped, dependent. He didn't see the woman who was quietly rising from the ashes of his betrayal. He didn't know that humiliation once endured could transform into power. And he certainly didn't know that the man in the ballroom, the one who would publicly expose him, was already a part of my plan. Because this story wasn't ending with me broken, it was ending with him exposed. After the storm of betrayal and humiliation, life seemed to exist in two parallel worlds. Outwardly, I was still the same woman Mark had known, polite, reserved, careful not to draw attention. But beneath the surface, I was different. Every word he had said, every manipulation, every small cruelty had become fuel. I started small, secretly. I opened a discreet savings account under a different name, a hidden digital vault of my earnings, painstakingly growing my resources one small deposit at a time. Every night, after Mark had gone to sleep, I reviewed our finances, tracing every withdrawal, noting inconsistencies, collecting evidence. I became meticulous, almost obsessive, because I had learned that even the smallest oversight could be my undoing, or my weapon. At the same time, I rebuilt my confidence. I enrolled in online courses I had once dreamed of but abandoned for the sake of us. Marketing, finance, negotiation, skills I knew could never be taken from me. Each lesson, each certificate was a silent act of rebellion, a declaration that I would not remain powerless. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. I began reaching out quietly, forging connections of people I could trust. There was Julia, a former colleague who had always been sharp-eyed and discreet. Then there was Ethan, a lawyer who specialized in corporate misconduct, someone I approached under the guise of professional advice, but who quickly became an ally. Most crucially, there was the man in the blue suit, the stranger from the ballroom. I had noticed him before, of course, calm, composed, observing without judgment. It wasn't coincidence that he stood up for me publicly. He was a private investigator, skilled, precise, and quietly aligned with my interests. Together, we began building the framework of what would become my strategy. Every interaction with Mark was carefully observed. Every boast, every careless remark, every financial maneuver was cataloged. I learned his patterns, his arrogance, his belief that he could never be challenged, and I collected proof. Emails, messages, bank statements, recordings, and a network of witnesses ready to corroborate every lie, every betrayal. It wasn't easy. Each step carried risk. A wrong move, a slip of discretion, and he would suspect, retaliate, or worse. I learned patience. I learned to smile while planning, to endure while strategizing, and to appear vulnerable while becoming unstoppable. During this time, small victories kept me going. Mark tried to belittle me in front of his friends, unaware that I had already documented every word. He boasted about his control over finances, unaware that the secret accounts I had built quietly were growing faster than his own assets. He laughed at my supposed naivety, not realizing that every act of humiliation only sharpened my resolve. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my allies became more than just support. They became an extension of my strategy. Julia handled communications, ensuring Mark remained unaware of our moves. Ethan reviewed documents, highlighting every legal leverage point. And the investigator, he provided insight, foresight, and when the time came, the final piece that would unravel everything Mark had believed untouchable. By the end of that year, I was no longer the woman who had once trembled at his words. I was prepared. I was ready. I had rebuilt my life, quietly, meticulously, and with purpose. And I knew, deep down, the moment of reckoning was approaching, because Mark had underestimated me at every turn. And when someone underestimates you, they leave the door wide open for your return. The man in the blue suit once told me, quietly but firmly, "You're stronger than you think. The world has no idea who you really are, and soon neither will he." I didn't smile then. I simply nodded. But inside, I was counting the days, the moves, and the perfect moment when everything would shift.
It started subtly at first. Mark didn't notice the changes at home, the quiet glances I exchanged with Julia or the hurried notes I left in hidden corners. He believed I was still the same timid, dependent woman he could manipulate at will. That overconfidence would be his downfall. The first real confrontation came during a dinner party at our apartment. Friends were laughing, the clinking of glasses blending with soft jazz in the background. Mark, predictably, took center stage, recounting stories of my failures in front of everyone. "You know," he said, leaning back with a smug smile, "I don't know how she managed even half the bills. I guess someone has to teach her how money really works." The room stilled. I could feel the familiar heat of humiliation creeping up my cheeks, but this time I didn't shrink. Instead, I calmly excused myself under the pretext of fetching dessert. In the kitchen, I texted Julia a discreet note. "Check the accounts," he showed the guests. Moments later, she replied with a screenshot confirming discrepancies in his statements. A small, quiet victory, but enough to fuel the next move. Mark's arrogance grew bolder over the weeks. He tried to flaunt his control over mutual investments, mocking my supposed inability to make decisions. But each act, each boast, was recorded, cataloged, and analyzed. I had learned to observe without reacting, letting him underestimate my patience. One afternoon, he cornered me in our living room, voice dripping with condescension. "Do you realize how little you've actually contributed to our life? Honestly, I don't know why anyone would rely on you for anything." I paused, measuring every word before responding. "Mark, it's funny you say that, because the records tell a different story. I've been keeping track." His brow furrowed, a flicker of unease crossing his face, quickly masked by a laugh. "Oh, come on, you're joking, right?" I smiled faintly, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension grow. He didn't realize that the man who had once stood up in the ballroom, the one he had dismissed, was now in our orbit, ready to intervene when the time came.
Meanwhile, small cracks appeared in his social world. Friends and colleagues who once admired his charm began noticing inconsistencies. A carefully timed message here, a discreet verification there, and slowly whispers began to circulate. Mark's frustration grew bolder. He tried to tighten his control, to intimidate, to belittle me further. But I had grown stronger. Each attempt he made was met with quiet resistance, patience, and calculated countermeasures. Every time he tried to humiliate me publicly, evidence of his manipulation and deceit waited quietly in the wings. By now, the conflict was no longer private. It was a game of power. He believed he controlled the board, unaware that every move he made was anticipated, documented, and would eventually be used against him. The escalation reached its peak one evening when he tried to humiliate me during a business meeting I had arranged with key contacts. He mocked my abilities, laughed at my proposals, and dismissed my suggestions. But this time I was prepared. With subtle signals, Julia and the investigator coordinated a series of revelations that exposed his lies, inconsistencies, and unethical tactics before the entire room. The laughter that once empowered him faded. The smug confidence disappeared. He was no longer in control. He was exposed, confused, and flailing. And for the first time, I felt the intoxicating clarity of knowing that the scales had begun to tip. Conflict had escalated beyond private arguments. This was now a battle of strategy, patience, and resilience. And in this battle, I was no longer the underdog. The final pieces were in place. Every ally, every bit of evidence, every calculated move had positioned me for the ultimate confrontation. The climax was approaching, and Mark had no idea that the woman he once thought powerless was now ready to reclaim everything he had taken. The morning started like any other, but I knew it wouldn't end that way. Mark was confident, oblivious, smug in his usual arrogance. He believed he had me cornered, trapped, and unaware of the storm brewing silently beneath his nose. I had spent months preparing this moment. Every word he had spoken against me, every lie, every act of manipulation had been cataloged, backed by evidence, and aligned with a quiet network I had built. Today, the balance would begin to shift. It began with a phone call. The man in the blue suit, calm and precise, instructed me on timing, phrasing, and delivery. I was to remain composed, confident, unshakable. Every move was calculated to strip Mark of his public facade. As Mark paced in his study, checking his emails, I answered, holding a folder I had labeled simply, "Everything." "Mark," I said softly, almost innocuously, "we need to talk about our finances, about transparency." He laughed, the usual arrogance curling his lips. "Oh, so now you're a financial expert?" I ignored the jab. Opening the folder, I laid out months of meticulous records, discrepancies, manipulated transactions, and evidence of his abuses. I didn't shout, I didn't plead, I simply presented the facts. Mark's brow furrowed, confusion flashing across his face. How did you get this?" A faint smile touched my lips. "Do you remember all the times you underestimated me? All the times you laughed thinking I was naive?" His eyes darted around the room, searching for the hidden cameras, the trap, the trick. But there was nothing. Just me, composed, unwavering, and armed with the truth. "You don't understand," he hissed, the arrogance cracking into panic. "I controlled everything. You couldn't—" "You were wrong," I interrupted. "I was watching. I was learning. And now, everything changes." Then the investigator stepped in, bringing with him confirmation from banks, contracts, and legal documents. Julia coordinated the timing, ensuring that key witnesses were ready to corroborate everything. Within minutes, the room was no longer mine alone. It was a stage where Mark's control crumbled, piece by piece. He tried to assert dominance, to deny, to twist the narrative, but each word was countered by evidence, by witnesses, by logic. His confidence, once impenetrable, began to falter. The mask slipped, revealing panic, vulnerability, and finally, the truth. He had miscalculated entirely. The climax of the turning point came when he realized that the man who had once stood up in the ballroom, the one he had dismissed and laughed at, was not only part of my plan, but instrumental in exposing him. Mark's world, carefully constructed on arrogance and deception, was collapsing before his eyes. And in that collapse, I felt an unexpected surge, not of revenge, but of liberation. For the first time in years, I was free. Free from fear, free from dependence, free of the illusion that my worth was tied to someone else's approval. This turning point was more than exposure. It was transformation. The woman who had trembled in the ballroom was no longer the same. I had become the architect of my own destiny, the silent force who had waited patiently, learned carefully, and now acted decisively. Mark's gaze, once proud and unyielding, now reflected shock, confusion, and fear. And in that gaze, I saw not just his defeat, but the realization that the game had changed, and I was no longer playing by his rules.
The Riverside Community Center smelled of anticipation, coffee, and cheap perfume, just like it did on that night I was humiliated. But this time, I wasn't trembling, clutching my purse or praying for the ground to swallow me whole. This time, I walked in with purpose, my shoulders squared, eyes steady, heart unshakable. Mark was already there, early as always, smug in his tailored suit, confident that the evening would unfold exactly as he had rehearsed in his mind. He glanced at me, smiled condescendingly, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Still trying to play the victim, huh?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Every person in the room would soon see the truth for themselves. The man in the blue suit, my silent ally, was waiting quietly in the back row. Julia and Ethan had coordinated with witnesses, ready to step in at precise moments. Everything was in place. Months of careful planning, observation, and patience were about to bear fruit. As Mark began his speech, flaunting achievements and mocking my incompetence, I stepped forward. Calmly, confidently, I pulled out the first piece of evidence. One by one, I revealed financial manipulations, lies, and documented abuses. Screens lit up, emails projected, recordings played, and witnesses spoke, each word slicing through Mark's carefully constructed persona. The room went silent, then murmurs spread like wildfire. Faces that had once admired him now turned in disbelief. Whispers grew louder, and all at once, the balance of power shifted. Mark tried to interject, tried to charm, tried to gaslight, but this time no one listened. Each lie was countered with evidence, each boast dismantled by facts. And when he glanced toward me, the woman he had mocked, underestimated, and humiliated, he saw not fear, but triumph. For the first time, he looked small, vulnerable, exposed. The confidence that had carried him through years of manipulation crumbled in real time, leaving behind panic and shame. A gasp echoed through the room as the final piece of evidence was revealed, the one that left Mark utterly speechless. The man in the blue suit, once a stranger, now stepped forward, confirming everything with authority and precision. The whispers of, "Oh my God," rose from the crowd, sealing Mark's downfall. I remained silent, letting the truth speak louder than any words I could have uttered. And inside, I felt a shift, a release, a victory, a liberation that went beyond revenge. Mark had underestimated me at every step, but patience, strategy, and quiet resilience had turned the tables completely.
As people processed the revelation, Mark's gaze met mine for the first time in months. There was no arrogance left, no smirk, only recognition. Recognition that he had been defeated, not by force, but by strength he had ignored, by intelligence he had dismissed, and by a woman he had underestimated entirely. The ballroom, once a place of humiliation, had transformed into a stage of empowerment. And in that transformation, I realized something vital. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my independence, and my voice. Mark slumped in defeat, the weight of exposure pressing down, while I stood tall, the woman I had always been quietly becoming fully visible. Strong, unbroken, unstoppable. And as the murmurs of shock turned into applause, I knew the story had reached its peak. The climax wasn't just about his downfall, it was about my rise. Because I had survived, endured, planned, and now, finally, triumphed. The Riverside Community Center, once a place of humiliation and whispered judgments, now echoed with a different energy. People lingered, processing what had happened, some in awe, others in quiet admiration. I walked through the room, head held high, feeling the weight of months, years even, lifting from my shoulders. Mark had been exposed, his arrogance shattered. He slunk away, his carefully crafted image in ruins, leaving behind the fragments of a man who had underestimated me at every turn. I didn't feel satisfaction and vengeance alone. It was something deeper. Relief, freedom, empowerment, and the undeniable truth that I had reclaimed my life. Julia came up beside me, a warm smile on her face. "You did it," she said softly. I nodded, feeling a lump of emotion in my throat. We did it, together. The man in the blue suit, my silent guardian, my strategist, offered a small, approving nod. There were no words needed. The plan had worked. Months of meticulous preparation, patience, and quiet strength had culminated in this moment. I thought back to the woman who had trembled in that ballroom, clutching her purse, cheeks burning with shame. I would never forget that fear, that humiliation. But I also realized that fear had been the seed of resilience. Every tear, every stolen moment, every quiet act of defiance had prepared me for this victory. I had learned something invaluable. Strength is not always loud. Power is not always visible, and independence is built quietly, patiently, often in the shadows of adversity. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the city lights reflecting off wet streets, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: unshakable peace. The storm of betrayal had passed. What remained was clarity, purpose, and the knowledge that I was no longer defined by anyone else's control. And for anyone listening, watching, or reading this story, remember this: your value is never measured by someone else's approval. Humiliation can be a teacher, betrayal a catalyst, and patience a weapon. Stand quietly if you must, plan carefully, and when the time comes, reclaim your dignity with unwavering courage. Because no one has the right to define your worth, and no one can take your power unless you allow them to. This story isn't just about me. It's about the truth that strength, resilience, and strategy can turn any moment of despair into a triumph beyond imagination. Mark didn't see it coming. Neither did the world, but I did. And that made all the difference.